He was born a demigod of the House of Habsburg, destined to command armies and rule an empire. Yet, he spent his adult life covered in engine grease, smuggling illegal cinema reels through the back alleys of Vienna like a common criminal, and died penniless in a public hospital ward, only to be buried with full honors in the Imperial Crypt alongside the very emperors whose world had rejected him. His name was Archduke Rainer of Austria, the mechanic prince. How did a man born to wear the Golden Fleece end up fighting for survival with a wrench in his hand, becoming the only royal to trade a crown for a carburetor? To answer that, we must go back to a time before the grease and the grime, to a moment when his future seemed carved in marble. That collision was inevitable. Rainer was crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled: the frozen imperial glory he was born to preserve, and the chaotic mechanical future he was destined to survive. When Rainer Karl, Leopold Blanca, Anton Margareta Beatrix, Peter Joseph Raphael, Michael Ignaz, Stefan of Austria drew his first breath on November 21st, 1895, he did not just enter a family, he entered a machine. He was born into the House of Habsburg Lorraine, a dynasty that had woven itself into the spinal cord of European history for 6 centuries. At the moment of his birth, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a sprawling, multi-ethnic leviathan, a dual monarchy that stretched from the snowy peaks of the Tyrolean Alps to the sun-baked shores of the Adriatic, encompassing a kaleidoscope of languages, religions, and simmering resentments, all held together by the terrifyingly rigid protocol of the imperial court in Vienna and the aging, whiskered figure of Emperor Franz Joseph I. Rainer was born in Igram, modern-day Zagreb, a city that perfectly encapsulated the tensions of the empire itself. It was a place of administrative order and military precision, yet it sat on the fault lines of Balkan nationalism, a city where the coffee houses buzzed with the High German of the occupiers and the fervent Croatian of the patriots. But for the infant Archduke, these political realities were distant abstractions, muffled by the velvet curtains of the nursery. He was the first son of Archduke Leopold Salvator of Austria and Infanta Blanca of Spain, a union that represented the absolute zenith of Catholic royalism. To look at his baptismal certificate was to look at a map of royal Europe. His godparents and cousins occupied the thrones of Spain, Italy, and Austria. Fate had dealt Rainer a hand of cards that seemed unbeatable. He was born to command, born to be saluted, and born to inherit a world of static, frozen grandeur. Yet, even in the nursery, there were anomalies, subtle hints that this particular Archduke would not fit neatly into the marble mold prepared for him. The primary architect of this difference was his father, Archduke Leopold Salvator. In a family known for its rigid adherence to tradition and its suspicion of modernity, Leopold Salvator was a startling aberration. He was a prince of Tuscany, a branch of the Habsburg family that had always carried a reputation for intellectualism, eccentricity, and a certain liberal flair. Leopold was a soldier, yes, an inspector general of artillery, who understood the mathematics of ballistics and the geometry of death. But his true passion lay not in the parade ground, but in the workshop. He was an inventor, a man fascinated by the grinding gears of the Industrial Revolution that was belatedly sweeping through Austria. While other archdukes spent their fortunes on racehorses, mistresses, or hunting lodges, Leopold Salvator spent his time patenting mechanical inventions. He was obsessed with the internal combustion engine, a noisy, smelly, and dirty contraption that the old Emperor Franz Joseph viewed with deep suspicion. Young Rainer grew up in this dual reality, a psychological split that would define his entire tragic trajectory. On one side was the influence of his mother, Infanta Blanca. She was the daughter of Carlos, Duke of Madrid, the Carlist pretender to the Spanish throne. Blanca was a woman of iron spine and medieval faith, a matriarch who believed in the divine right of kings with a fervor that was almost terrifying. She raised Rainer and his siblings in a strictly Catholic, strictly royalist atmosphere, where every gesture was a symbol and every interaction was governed by the hierarchy of blood. From her, Rainer learned the heavy, suffocating responsibility of his name. He learned that to be a Habsburg was to be chosen by God to lead, a burden that could never be set aside. But then there was the father. Rainer spent his childhood watching Archduke Leopold Salvator vanish into the garages of the Palais Toscana in Vienna, or their estate at Schloss Herrnstein, emerging hours later with grease under his fingernails and the scent of gasoline clinging to his uniform. Leopold did not just drive cars, he dismantled them. He understood how things worked. He taught Rainer that the world was not just made of decrees and treaties, but of pistons, spark plugs, and torque. This was a radical education for an imperial prince. While his cousins were learning the precise angle at which to bow to an empress, Rainer was learning how to strip a carburetor. He was being given a dangerous gift, a practical skill set. In the gilded cage of the monarchy, usefulness was considered vulgar. A gentleman did not work with his hands. A gentleman commanded others to do so. By teaching his son the mechanics of the modern world, Leopold Salvator was unknowingly preparing him for a life that no one believed would ever come to pass, a life where the crown would be worthless and the wrench would be the only thing putting food on the table. The family's primary residence, the Palais Toscana in Vienna's 4th district, was a physical manifestation of this immense wealth and privilege. It was a palace of staggering proportions, filled with liveried servants, priceless tapestries, and the hushed whispers of court gossip. But the Tuscan branch, as they were known, were wealthy even by Habsburg standards. They were independent, deriving income from vast estates in Galicia and modern-day Czechia. This financial independence allowed them a degree of freedom that the closer relatives of the emperor did not possess. The Tuscan tribe, as Rainer and his 9 siblings were sometimes called, were a boisterous, energetic clan. They were not the somber, inbred ghosts that haunted the Hofburg Palace. They were alive, modern, and vibrant. They drove automobiles through the streets of Vienna when cars were still a rarity, causing heads to turn and horses to shy. They were the celebrities of the imperial twilight, photogenic and dashing. As Rainer transitioned from boyhood to adolescence, the pressure to conform to the dynastic mold intensified. In 1908, the year Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina and set the clock ticking toward doomsday, Rainer was entering the phase of life where an archduke becomes a public asset. His education was taken over by military tutors. He was schooled in strategy, in history, in several languages of the empire: German, Hungarian, maybe a smattering of Croatian or Italian. He was being forged into an officer. The Habsburg mythos demanded that every male heir be a soldier first and a man second. He was given his first commissions, poured into the immaculate, tight-fitting tunics of the imperial and royal army. Photographs from this era show a handsome young man with the distinctive heavy eyelids of the Habsburgs, looking out at the camera with a mixture of arrogance and vulnerability. He looks like a porcelain figure, exquisite and fragile. But underneath the uniform, the mechanic's heart was beating. Rainer was observing the modernization of the military with a keen, technical eye. He saw that the cavalry charges and the colorful uniforms were obsolete. He understood, perhaps better than the generals aged in the wars of the 19th century, that the next war would be a war of machines. It would be a war of artillery, of trucks, of logistics. He gravitated toward the technical corps, following in his father's footsteps into the artillery. This was the branch of warfare that required mathematics and engineering, not just blind courage. It was a choice that reflected his personality: pragmatic, grounded, and fascinated by power. Not political power, but kinetic power. The years leading up to 1914 were a time of surreal, deceptive beauty in Vienna. This was the era of the fin de siècle, the end of the century, where art and culture flourished in a feverish, desperate bloom. The coffee houses were full of revolutionaries and poets. Trotsky, Freud, Klimt, and Hitler all walked the same streets as Archduke Rainer. The waltzes played on, louder and faster, as if to drown out the sound of the tectonic plates grinding beneath the continent. For a young Archduke, life was a whirlwind of balls, hunting parties at Schloss Herrnstein, and summers on the Adriatic coast. It was a life of absolute security. The idea that the empire could cease to exist was as absurd as the idea that the sun could fail to rise. The emperor had been on the throne since 1848. He was a permanent fixture of the universe. Rainer had no reason to suspect that he was dancing on the rim of a volcano. Yet there were cracks in the marble. The ethnic tensions in the empire were boiling over. In the parliament, chairs were thrown during debates. In the streets of Prague and Budapest, riots were becoming common. Rainer, traveling between the family estates, would have seen the sullen faces of the subjects, the graffiti on the walls, the growing resentment against the German dominance of the dynasty. Did he sense the danger, or was he, like so many of his class, insulated by the glass walls of his limousine? His father, the inventor, certainly sensed the shifting winds of technology, but even he could not predict the sociological catastrophe that was approaching. The family continued to accumulate wealth, to arrange marriages, to plan for a future that would span decades. Rainer was being groomed for a high command, perhaps a governorship, a life of service to a crown that was already rusting from the inside out. By the spring of 1914, Rainer was 18 years old. He was a lieutenant, a prince, a young man with the world at his feet. He had the swagger of youth and the security of centuries of tradition behind him. He was likely preoccupied with the trivialities of aristocratic life, new uniforms, the latest model of automobile his father had purchased, perhaps a flirtation with a countess. He stood at the very pinnacle of the social pyramid of the Western world. But the irony of his position was cruel. He was being trained to rule a world that was about to commit suicide. He was a master of a house that was already burning, even if the smoke hadn't yet reached the upper floors. The summer of 1914 arrived with a glorious, sweltering heat, the kind of weather that makes the grain grow tall and the blood run hot. The family dispersed to their summer residences, packing their trunks for what they assumed would be another season of leisure. Then came the telegram, June 28, 1914, Sarajevo, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The heir to the throne was dead. For the family, it was a personal tragedy. Franz Ferdinand was a cousin, a difficult and prickly man, but family nonetheless. But for the empire, it was the pull of the trigger that would detonate the world. Rainer, as a junior officer and a member of the Imperial House, would have been thrust immediately into the center of the crisis. The funeral in Vienna was a somber, hushed affair, a thunderstorm of black crape and whispered fears. The old Emperor Franz Joseph, stone-faced and stoic, buried his heir and prepared for the ultimatum. The mobilization orders began to go out. The trains, which Rainer's father loved for their mechanical efficiency, began to fill not with grain or goods, but with men. Rainer exchanged his dress whites for the field gray of the war machine. This was no longer a drill. This was the moment he had been born for, the moment the dynasty justified its existence by leading its people into fire. But as he strapped on his sword and checked his pistol, Archduke Rainer could not have known that he was not marching toward glory. He was marching toward the erasure of his own identity. He was leaving the Palais Toscana as a demigod, but the forces unleashed in that hot summer would ensure that he would never, ever return to it as the same man. The Golden Age was over. The Age of Iron had begun. If the summer of 1914 was the last golden sunset of the old world, the autumn that followed was the sudden, violent onset of a permanent midnight. For Archduke Rainer, the transition from the ballroom to the battlefield was jarring, absolute, and irreversible. The uniforms had been tailored, the swords polished, and the farewells spoken on train platforms, drowning in flowers and patriotic hymns. But the reality that awaited the 19-year-old Archduke on the front lines bore no resemblance to the colorful chivalric paintings that adorned the walls of the Hofburg Palace. The war was not a pageant. It was an industrial slaughterhouse, a grinding machine that consumed flesh and iron with indifferent efficiency. And for a young man raised to believe in the divine protection of his lineage, the trenches offered a terrifying revelation. Artillery shells did not check genealogies before they detonated. Rainer was deployed initially to the Eastern Front against the Russian Empire, a vast freezing expanse of mud and misery, before finding his true crucible on the Italian front. When Italy entered the war in 1915, betraying its former alliance with Austria-Hungary, the conflict moved to the jagged peaks of the Alps and the stony banks of the Isonzo River. This was the Alpenkrieg, the Mountain War, and it was here that Rainer, serving as an officer of artillery, stared into the abyss of modern warfare. The Italian front was a nightmare landscape that defied military logic. Soldiers were not just fighting the enemy, they were fighting gravity and geology. They hauled massive Skoda cannons, weighing tons, up sheer cliff faces, using systems of pulleys and desperate human strength. They dug tunnels through solid glaciers, living inside the ice like troglodytes. For Rainer, whose father had instilled in him a fascination with mechanics, this was a grim masterclass in engineering. He saw how the internal combustion engine, the very thing his father loved, was used to drag supplies up mountain passes. He saw the logistics of death, the train schedules, the ammunition quotas, the precise mathematical calculations required to lob a shell over a mountain peak to obliterate a devastatingly invisible enemy. But there was a deeper psychological transformation occurring within the young Archduke. In the high command bunkers, the generals still drank wine from crystal glasses and looked at maps with the detached arrogance of the 19th century. But Rainer was a junior officer. He was closer to the mud. He saw the men of the empire, the Hungarian hussars, the Czech infantrymen, the Tyrolean sharpshooters, dying in droves. He saw the horrific wounds caused by rock splinters, created when shells hit the dolomite stone, turning the mountains themselves into shrapnel. In the screaming chaos of a barrage, the rigid social hierarchy of Vienna evaporated. A dead archduke looked exactly like a dead peasant. The mystique of his bloodline, that invisible shield his mother Infanta Blanca had taught him to trust, was proven to be an illusion. The war was the great equalizer, and it was stripping Rainer of his imperial vanity layer by layer. Back in Vienna, the center was not holding. In November 1916, the unthinkable happened. Emperor Franz Joseph I, the man who had ruled for 68 years, longer than most of his subjects had been alive, died. His death was a seismic event. For millions, Franz Joseph was the empire. He was the glue that held the disparate nations together. Rainer returned to Vienna for the funeral, a spectacle of black velvet and somber pageantry that felt less like a farewell to a man and more like a funeral for history itself. As Rainer walked in the procession behind the hearse drawn by black horses, he must have felt the chill of the future. The new emperor, Charles I, was young, well-meaning, and desperate for peace, but he was inheriting a corpse. The blockade by the Allied powers was strangling the country. By 1917 and 1918, the golden Vienna of Rainer's youth was a ghost town. The turnip winter had set in. There was no coal, there was no meat. The coffee houses that had once served cream cakes now served a bitter sludge made of roasted barley. The people were starving. The glorious tapestries of the Palais Toscana could not be eaten, and the gold leaf on the picture frames could not heat the drafty rooms. The contrast between the front lines and the home front began to blur. Both were zones of deprivation and despair. Rainer, visiting home on leave, would have seen the hollow eyes of the civilians, the very people his family claimed a divine right to rule. The social contract was breaking. Why should these people bow to a Habsburg when the Habsburgs could not even provide bread? The end came in the autumn of 1918, not with a bang, but with a total systemic collapse. The failure of the final offensives, the entry of America into the war, and the internal disintegration of the army sealed the empire's fate. Regiments simply stopped fighting. Hungarian units refused to obey Austrian officers. The Slavic nations declared independence. The kaleidoscope was shattered. Rainer, retreating with the remnants of his battery, witnessed the dissolution of the imperial and royal army, once one of the most powerful forces on earth, into a disorganized mob of angry, hungry men trying to walk home. On November 11th, 1918, Emperor Charles renounced his participation in the affairs of state, though he crucially refused to abdicate. The Republic of German Austria was proclaimed the next day. The double eagle was torn down from public buildings. The word imperial was scrubbed from the stationery. Overnight, Archduke Rainer became a relic. He was 23 years old, a veteran of a lost war, a prince of a non-existent throne, standing in the ruins of a world that had rejected him. The months that followed were a time of chaos and existential dread for the family. The new Republican government was terrified of a Habsburg restoration. They viewed the family not as citizens, but as a viral threat to the new democracy. In April 1919, the National Assembly passed the Habsburg Law. It was a brutal ultimatum, a legal guillotine for the dynasty. It stated that all members of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine were banished from the country and their property confiscated unless they did two things. First, formally renounce their membership in the imperial house and all claims to the throne, and second, declare themselves to be loyal citizens of the Republic. This was the moment of the Great Schism for the Tuscan line. For Rainer's parents, Archduke Leopold Salvatore and Infanta Blanca, the choice was agonizing but clear. Blanca, with her fiery Spanish Carlist blood, would sooner cut off her hand than sign a document renouncing her divine rights. To her, the Republic was an illegitimate abomination, a temporary madness of the mob. Leopold Salvatore, too, could not bring himself to bow to the socialists who had seized his country. They chose exile. They packed what they could: jewelry, family icons, the portable remnants of their glory, and prepared to leave for Barcelona, where the Spanish cousins offered refuge. But Rainer did not pack. The young Archduke stood at the crossroads of his identity. On one side was the path of his parents, exile, a life of wandering Europe as a pretender, living on the charity of foreign relatives, clinging to empty titles in dusty salons, forever looking backward. On the other side was the unknown, staying in Vienna, the city of his birth, but staying as a commoner. It meant stripping himself of the title Archduke. It meant becoming Heir Habsburg. It meant acknowledging that the divine right was dead. Why did he stay? It is the central mystery of his life, but the clues lie in his character. The war had changed him. He had seen the reality of the world, the mud, the mechanics, the raw survival. Perhaps the mechanic prince realized that in a modern world, a man's worth was not in his titles, but in his utility. He looked at the broken, starving city of Vienna and saw not just a graveyard, but a challenge. He had his father's technical mind. He believed he could survive. He believed he could work. There was also the pragmatic reality of the family fortune. The Habsburg law confiscated imperial properties, but private estates were a different legal matter. By becoming a citizen, Rainer hoped to save some of the family's assets, particularly Schloss Herrnstein, from the voracious appetite of the state. He would be the anchor, the rear guard left behind to salvage what could be salvaged. The scene of the family's departure must have been heart-wrenching. The parents, old and defeated, boarding the train that would take them out of history. And Rainer, the eldest son, standing on the platform, waving goodbye not just to his mother and father, but to the entire concept of who he was supposed to be. When the train disappeared, he turned back to face a hostile Vienna. He went to the authorities. He took the pen, a pen that felt heavier than any artillery shell he had ever lifted, and signed the document. I, Rainer Karl, hereby renounce. With that signature, the Archduke died. In his place stood a tall, somewhat melancholic young man with a talent for engines and a desperate need to make a living. He was now a citizen of a republic that despised his name, armed with nothing but his wits, and a ring of keys to a garage that was about to become his castle. The gilded twilight was gone. The iron furnace of the war had cooled into the hard gray concrete of survival. Rainer was about to embark on one of the most bizarre second acts in royal history. He was going to get a job. To step into Vienna in 1920 was to step into a city that had lost its mind. The war was over, but the peace was a hallucination. The Treaty of Saint-Germain had carved the flesh off the Austrian bones, reducing a majestic empire of 50 million souls to a truncated, landlocked rump state of 6 million, a head without a body. The grand boulevards of the Ringstrasse, designed for imperial parades, were now populated by war cripples begging for shillings and war profiteers flashing diamonds that shone too brightly in the gloom. But the most terrifying ghost haunting the city was not a person, it was the currency. Hyperinflation is not just an economic event, it is a psychological trauma. The Austrian krone, once the gold standard currency of Central Europe, began to freefall. A life savings that could have bought a villa in 1914 could barely buy a loaf of bread in 1920. Middle-class lawyers sold their daughters' pianos for firewood. Countesses worked as seamstresses. The social hierarchy was put into a blender and pulverized. In this surreal, desperate landscape, where money was worthless and survival was everything, Archduke Rainer, now simply Herr Rainer Habsburg, found his strange, gritty salvation. He had chosen to stay. He had signed the papers. But a signature does not put food on the table. The new Republican government had confiscated the imperial properties, the Hofburg and Schönbrunn, but they had not yet fully seized the private assets of the Tuscan branch. Rainer was allowed to inhabit a wing of the Palais Toscana, the massive family palace in the 4th District. But it was a hollow victory. The palace was a cold, echoing cavern. The heating systems required coal that didn't exist. The servants were gone. The crystal chandeliers hung in the darkness like frozen tears. It was here, in the courtyard of this Baroque masterpiece, that Rainer committed his great act of class treason. He opened the garage doors. Rainer did not view the automobile as a luxury toy, as his cousins did. He viewed it as a tool of commerce, drawing on the mechanical education his father had given him, and utilizing the few vehicles the family had managed to hide from requisition during the war. Rainer established a transport and repair business. Imagine the visual dissonance. The heavy ornate wooden gates of a princely palace swinging open not to admit a royal carriage, but to let out a noisy, smoke-belching truck driven by the former heir to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. He became the mechanic prince. To the old aristocracy, huddled in their freezing apartments and clinging to their etiquette, Rainer's new career was a scandal. It was vulgar. It was American. A Habsburg did not touch grease. A Habsburg did not negotiate prices with a grocer. But Rainer understood what the old guard did not. Dignity is a luxury of the Fed. He threw himself into the work with a manic energy. He was often seen under the chassis of a truck, wearing oil-stained coveralls, his face smudged with grime, wrenching a bolt loose with bruised knuckles. When he walked into the local taverns after a shift, he didn't demand a salute. He demanded a beer. This transformation earned him a strange, grudging respect from the Viennese working class. Vienna was becoming Red Vienna, a stronghold of socialism. The workers hated the monarchy, but they had a soft spot for the Red Archduke, who wasn't afraid to dirty his hands. He was a curiosity, a living symbol of the new egalitarian age. Look, they would say, even the emperor's nephew has to work for his schnitzel. But repairing trucks was small change. The real money in 1920s, Vienna was in the distraction industry. The people were miserable, cold, and hungry. They didn't want reality. They wanted escape. They wanted the cinema. The silent film era was exploding. Vienna had hundreds of small kinos, converted storefronts, and theaters where flickering projectors showed Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and the epic productions of the German UFA studios. For an hour, a Viennese worker could forget the inflation and the cold. The cinema was the opium of the masses, and business was booming. There was, however, a logistical bottleneck. Film prints were incredibly expensive to rent. The distributors charged a fortune for a copy of the latest hit. A small neighborhood theater in the working-class district of Ottakring could not afford to rent a print of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari for a whole week on its own. The economics didn't work. They needed a way to show the movie without paying the full price. Enter Rainer and his shadow court. Rainer, with his fleet of motorcycles and cars and his desperate need for cash, became the central node in a system known as Radeln, bicycling. It was a scheme that sat squarely in the gray zone between ingenuity and fraud. Here is how the mechanism worked. A consortium of 5 or 6 small theater owners would pool their money to rent a single print of a hit movie from the distributor. They would schedule their showtimes in a staggered cascade. Theater A would start the film at 6 p.m. Theater B would advertise the same film for 6:20 p.m. Theater C for 6:40 p.m. As soon as the first reel of the movie finished playing at Theater A, the projectionist would rip it off the machine, shove it into a metal canister, and run out the back door into the alley. There, waiting in the shadows on a vibrating, idling motorcycle, was a courier. Sometimes it was a hired hand. Sometimes it was Rainer himself. The courier would strap the canister to his back and gun the engine. Then began the film race. They had 20 minutes to cross Vienna. They had to dodge the police, the trams, the potholes, and the drunkards. They had to speed through rain, snow, and fog. They would roar up to the back door of Theater B, toss the canister to the waiting projectionist, who would thread it onto the machine just as the audience was getting restless. Then, the courier would wait for reel 2 at Theater A and do it all over again. It was a nightly high-wire act. If a tire blew, if a police officer stopped them for speeding, the chain would break. The movie would stop in 5 different theaters simultaneously. The audiences would riot. The theater owners would demand refunds. The stress was excruciating, but for Rainer, it was also intoxicating. After 4 years of static trench warfare, of sitting in mud waiting to die, this was movement. This was agency. He was the master of the city's arteries. He knew every shortcut, every alleyway, every traffic policeman's shift pattern. He was driving through the wreckage of his ancestors' capital, smuggling dreams in metal cans. And it paid. For a while the money flowed. Rainer was able to maintain the Palais Toscana. He was able to keep the wolves from the door. More importantly, he was able to send money to Barcelona. His parents, Leopold Salvatore and Blanca, were living in exile in Spain, but their financial situation was dire. They had lost their Austrian estates. They were dependent on the charity of the Spanish royal family and the remittances sent by their sons who had stayed behind. Rainer became the financial anchor of the exiled family. The pressure was immense. Every letter from Barcelona was a reminder of his duty. Is the money coming? Have you sold the timber from Herrnstein? God bless you, my son, for your sacrifice. He could not tell his mother, the pious Infanta, that the money keeping them fed came from defrauding film studios and running illegal courier services through the Viennese underworld. He had to maintain the facade of the respectable businessman while operating like a bootlegger. This double life began to take a psychological toll. Rainer was living in 2 worlds, but belonged to neither. In the garage, he was the boss, but he was still an Archduke. His employees bowed a little too deeply. There was a distance that could not be bridged. In the high society of Vienna, what was left of it, he was a pariah. He was invited to fewer parties. The respectable families didn't want to associate with the man who ran a taxi service for cinema reels. He was becoming a creature of the night, finding solace in the jazz clubs and the smoky back rooms of the film district. Yet there were moments of public triumph. Rainer's obsession with engines led him to the racetrack. In the early 1920s, motorsport was the sport of kings and daredevils. It was dangerous, loud, and modern, everything Rainer loved. He entered hill climb races, most notably the famous Semmering hill climb. Picture the scene, the Semmering Pass, a winding mountain road south of Vienna, lined with thousands of spectators. The air smells of pine needles and high-octane fuel. Rainer sits behind the wheel of a stripped-down Austro-Daimler or Puch racing car. He wears leather goggles and a cap turned backward. When the flag drops, he is not an Archduke. He is a pilot. He attacks the corners with a ferocity that surprises the professionals. He pushes the machine to its limit, the engine screaming against the red line. When he won, and he did achieve success in his class, the crowds cheered. "Habsburg! Habsburg!" they shouted. But what were they cheering for? Were they cheering for the dynasty? Or were they cheering for the underdog, the survivor, the man who had come down from the mountain of privilege to race in the dirt with them? For a fleeting moment on the podium, holding a trophy, Rainer looked like a winner. He looked like he had successfully reinvented himself. But the bicycle system was built on sand. It relied on the chaotic, unregulated nature of the early republic. As the 1920s progressed, the Austrian state began to stabilize. The currency reform of 1924 introduced the shilling, ending the hyperinflation. Order was returning. The film studios in Berlin and Hollywood began to crack down on piracy. They hired lawyers. They sent inspectors to Vienna to count the screenings. The gray zone where Rainer thrived was shrinking. The shadow court was coming under the spotlight. The theater owners, sensing the change in the wind, began to distance themselves from the risky schemes. They wanted legitimate contracts. They didn't want a courier on a motorcycle. They wanted a licensed distributor. Rainer, however, could not stop. The expenses of the Palais Toscana were astronomical. The demands from Spain never ceased. He was trapped on a treadmill that was moving faster and faster. He had to take bigger risks. He began to dabble in other ventures, real estate speculation, import-export deals, with questionable partners in the Balkans. He was chasing the next big score to plug the holes in his finances. It was during this period of frantic hustling that the seeds of his ultimate destruction were sown. He was exhausted. He was lonely. He was a man who had sprinted away from his past only to find that he was running in a circle. He had traded the rigid protocol of the court for the ruthless chaos of the market, and he was finding that the market could be just as cruel as any emperor. As 1924 drew to a close, the adrenaline of the early post-war years was fading, replaced by a cold, gnawing anxiety. The police had opened a file on Rainer Habsburg. The tax authorities were asking questions about the garage's revenue. The mechanic prince was still fixing engines, but the engine of his own life was beginning to knock. He was about to learn that while you can change your name and your clothes, you cannot easily change your fate when the world decides it is time to collect on old debts. If the early 1920s were a fever dream of adrenaline and survival for Rainer, the middle years of the decade were the cold, pounding headache of the morning after. The chaotic Wild West atmosphere of the early Republic, where a man with a fast motorcycle and loose morals could make a fortune, was evaporating. In its place came the crushing weight of bureaucracy, order, and memory. Austria was stabilizing. The currency was fixed. The police were back in uniform. And for a man like Rainer, who existed in the shadows between the old world and the new, stability was not a blessing. It was a trap. The unraveling of the mechanic prince began not with a grand explosion, but with the slow, humiliating drip of scandal. The bicycle system of film distribution had kept him afloat, but it had also placed him in proximity to the Viennese underworld. To the authorities, Rainer was no longer the tragic hero of a fallen dynasty. He was a suspect. The police dossier on Herr Habsburg grew thicker. It contained reports of copyright infringement, tax evasion, and unauthorized transport. The immunity that his blood had once provided was gone. In fact, his name now worked against him. A common smuggler might be let off with a bribe. A smuggling Archduke was a headline. The most damaging blow to his reputation came from the border. Throughout the early 1920s, Rainer traveled frequently. He was the conduit between the exiled family in Spain and their remaining assets in Central Europe. But in the paranoid geopolitical climate of the time, a Habsburg crossing a border was seen as a political act. In 1921, during a trip to Ljubljana, formerly Laibach, a city his family had once ruled, Rainer was arrested. The details were murky, involving irregular passport stamps and accusations of forgery, but the image was crystal clear and devastating. Picture the scene. The grandson of emperors standing in a bleak police station in the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. He is not wearing a general's uniform. He is wearing a travel-stained suit. He is not commanding the room. He is being fingerprinted. He is being yelled at by a border guard, who just 5 years earlier would have knelt in the mud as his carriage passed. The press in Vienna devoured the story. "The fallen Archduke," the headline screamed, "Habsburg arrested for forgery." They painted him not as a desperate son trying to help his exiled parents, but as a common grifter. The aristocracy, huddling in their salons, were horrified. They saw Rainer's disgrace as a collective stain. "Look at him," they whispered over their tea. "He plays at being a mechanic, and now he is a criminal. He has forgotten who he is." But Rainer hadn't forgotten. That was the tragedy. He knew exactly who he was, and he knew that who he was could no longer pay the bills. When he returned to Vienna, the city felt different, colder. The friends who had cheered him at the Semmering hill climb began to drift away. The shadow court of mechanics and film projectionists sensed the change in the wind. In the criminal underworld, heat is bad for business, and Rainer was radioactive. The theater owners, now fearing audits from the tax authorities, stopped taking his calls. The motorcycle engines in the garage at Palais Toscana grew silent, gathering dust. Then came the incident at Schloss Herrnstein. Herrnstein was Rainer's sanctuary. It was a beautiful Gothic revival castle south of Vienna, surrounded by deep pine forests. It was the one place where he could still pretend, if only for a weekend, that the world hadn't ended. But the world outside the castle walls was angry. The mid-1920s saw a rise in militant socialism in Austria. The Social Democratic Schutzbund and the right-wing militias were clashing in the streets. To the radical workers in the countryside, Herrnstein was a symbol of everything they hated: feudal privilege, unearned wealth, and the arrogance of the old order. One afternoon, a mob gathered at the gates of the castle. These were not foreign invaders. These were the locals, the villagers, the people whose grandfathers had been loyal retainers to Rainer's grandfather. They carried banners. They shouted insults. They demanded that the parasite leave. Rainer stood on the balcony of his ancestral home, looking down at the sea of angry faces. This was his ultimate nightmare come to life. He had renounced his title. He had worked with his hands. He had practically starved to stay in Austria. He had tried to be one of them. And yet, they still hated him. To them, he wasn't Rainer the mechanic. He was just another Habsburg to be evicted. Witnesses say he turned pale and stepped back into the shadows of the drawing room, closing the heavy curtains. It was a moment of profound psychological rupture. The rejection was total. The aristocracy despised him for becoming a worker, and the workers despised him for being an aristocrat. He was stranded on an island of his own making. Following the Herrnstein incident and the collapse of his film transport business, Rainer retreated into a profound isolation. He spent more time alone in the vast, empty wing of the Palais Toscana. The palace was decaying around him. Visitors from this period described a surreal atmosphere. You would ring the bell at the massive front gate, and after a long wait, the door would be opened not by a butler in livery, but by the Archduke himself, wearing a grease-stained cardigan, holding a lit cigarette. Inside, the furniture was covered in sheets. The air smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed clothes. Rainer had begun to sell off the family heirlooms to survive. A painting here, a silver set there. He was cannibalizing his heritage to buy coal. His mental state began to fray. The optimistic, dashing officer of 1914 was gone. In his place was a man haunted by bitterness. He felt betrayed by the republic he had sworn loyalty to. He felt abandoned by the family he was trying to support. The letters from Spain became a source of dread. His mother, Infanta Blanca, wrote of their difficulties in exile, of the need for funds. Rainer had to reply with lies, or worse, with silence. How could he tell the daughter of the carless pretender that her son was broke, that the police were watching him, and that the garage was empty? He sought solace in the only places that would accept him, the cheap bars of the 4th District. Rainer Habsburg, the great-grandson of Leopold II, became a fixture in the dive bars of Vienna. He drank cheap wine. He sat in the corner, chain-smoking, listening to the piano player. Occasionally, someone would recognize him. A drunk veteran might stumble over and try to salute, or a socialist might spit on the floor near his table. Rainer ignored them both. He was sinking into a deep, dark anonymity. It was during these twilight years, 1925-1926, that he made one final desperate attempt to find a place for himself. He tried to pivot from the gray market to legitimate innovation. He sketched plans for new automotive designs. He tried to patent improvements for projection equipment. He pitched ideas to investors. "I am Rainer Habsburg," he would say, trying to summon the old authority. "I know engines." But the investors looked at his frayed cuffs, his nervous eyes, and his police record. They saw a man who was essentially a high society wreckage. They politely declined. The mechanic prince was no longer a novelty. He was a tragedy. By 1927, a darkness had settled over him that no amount of tinkering could fix. The physical toll of the stress was becoming visible. He was thin, gaunt. His hands, once steady enough to thread a film reel in a moving sidecar, now shook. He was only 31 years old, but he looked 50. He was suffering from what we might now call severe burnout or depression, compounded by the existential trauma of losing his entire world. The final cruelty of this period was the silence. The roar of the motorcycles was gone. The applause of the racetrack was gone. The shouting of the sergeants was gone. All that was left was the ticking of the clock in the empty palace, measuring out the remaining time of a life that had lost its purpose. Rainer was a ghost haunting his own life, waiting for an end to a story that he no longer had the strength to write. The stage was set for the final act, not on a battlefield, but in a sterile white room where the only enemy left to fight was his own failing body. By the late 1920s, Vienna had become a city of deceptive quiet. The frantic, manic energy of the post-war years, the jazz, the cocaine, the valueless money, the desperate revolutions, had settled into a heavy, gray stagnation. The Wall Street crash of 1929 was sending shockwaves across the Atlantic that would soon shatter Europe again. But in the narrow streets of Vienna's 4th District, the economic depression had already moved in, unpacked its bags, and sat down at the kitchen table. For Rainer, who had spent a decade trying to outrun the collapse of his world, the race was finally over. He had run out of road. The final chapter of Rainer's life is not marked by a dramatic battle or a public speech. It is marked by a terrifying withdrawal. The mechanic prince, once so visible in his grease-stained coveralls, simply faded from view. He was no longer seen at the racing tracks. He was no longer seen arguing with theater owners in the back alleys of Leopoldstadt. He became a recluse within the crumbling walls of the Palais Toscana. We must pause to consider the physical reality of his existence in 1929. Rainer was 34 years old. In a different timeline, this would have been his prime. He would have been a general, perhaps a governor, married to a Saxon or Bavarian princess, surrounded by healthy children. In this reality, he was a bachelor living in a palace that was slowly dying around him. The vast rooms were unheated. The damp of the Danube seeped into the sandstone walls, bringing mold and rot. Rainer's health, compromised by the stress of the bicycle system years, the chain smoking, and the poor diet of a man living on the edge of poverty, began to fail. It is a cruel irony that a man born into a family that obsessed over lineage and blood would ultimately be destroyed by his own blood. In early 1930, Rainer fell ill It didn't start with a grand malady. It wasn't an assassin's bullet or a duel. It was likely something mundane, a neglected injury from the garage, a scrape, a weakened immune system unable to fight off a common bacteria. In the era before penicillin, the line between life and death was often drawn by a simple infection. For a Habsburg Archduke of the old empire, a team of court physicians would have been summoned at the first sign of a fever. They would have brought tinctures, poultices, and the comfort of attentive care. But Rainer was Herr Habsburg. He did not have court physicians. He had pride and he had poverty. He delayed seeking treatment. Perhaps he thought he could tough it out, just as he had toughed out the artillery barrages on the Italian front. Perhaps he simply didn't have the money for a private doctor. Whatever the reason, the infection was allowed to fester. It entered his bloodstream. Sepsis is a horrific way to die. It is a cascading failure of the body's systems. The fever spikes, bringing delirium. The blood pressure drops. The organs, the kidneys, the liver, the heart begin to shut down one by one. By the time Rainer was admitted to the hospital, he was already crossing the threshold. He was taken to the Wiedner Hospital. This is a crucial detail in the tragedy. The Wiedner was a respectable institution, but it was a public hospital. It was a place where the common citizens of Vienna went to die. When the ambulance arrived at the Palais Toscana to collect him, there were no liveried footmen to help him onto the stretcher. There was just the stark, clinical efficiency of the municipal health service. Lying in a hospital bed in a general ward, surrounded by the sounds of other dying men, clerks, laborers, pensioners, Rainer spent his final days in a delirium that we can only imagine. Did the fever burn away the years of the Republic? In his final hallucinations, did the peeling paint of the hospital ceiling transform back into the frescoes of the Hofburg? Did the nurse checking his pulse become his mother, Infanta Blanca, who was hundreds of miles away in Barcelona, unaware that her eldest son was dying? On May 25, 1930, the struggle ended. The heart of Archduke Rainer stopped beating. He was 34 years old. The moment he died, a strange alchemy occurred in Vienna. While he was alive, Rainer was an embarrassment, a class traitor to the royals, a parasite to the socialists, a criminal to the police. But in death, he was suddenly, safely, a Habsburg again. The Republic, which had stripped him of his titles, suddenly felt the heavy weight of history. You cannot simply dump the grandson of Leopold II into a pauper's grave without consequences. The news of his death flashed across the wires. In Spain, the exiled parents were crushed. The tragedy was compounded by the borders. They were exiles. They could not simply hop on a train to attend the funeral of their son. Negotiations had to be opened between the family and the Austrian government. In a rare gesture of humanity, or perhaps sensing the public mood, the Republic granted special permission. The banishment was temporarily lifted. The ghosts were allowed to return. The funeral of Archduke Rainer became the last great imperial pageant of the interwar period. It was a surreal, ghostly reenactment of the monarchy that had ceased to exist 12 years earlier. The body was prepared. The grease and the grime of the garage were washed away. He was dressed not in the mechanic's coveralls that had defined his adult life, but in the dress uniform of a knight of the Golden Fleece. The Order of the Golden Fleece, the oldest and most prestigious chivalric order in the world, was the ultimate symbol of Habsburg continuity. To bury him in it was a statement of defiance. It was the family saying, "You took his country, you took his money, but you cannot take his soul." On the day of the funeral, the streets of Vienna were lined with crowds. But these were not the angry mobs of Schloss Herrnstein. These were the silent, respectful, nostalgic crowds of Vienna. They came to see the end of a story. They watched as the hearse, drawn by black horses, made its way to the Capuchin Church. The Capuchin Church houses the Imperial Crypt, the Kaisergruft. This is the holy of holies for the dynasty. It is where 12 emperors and 18 empresses lie. To enter the crypt is to enter the history of Europe. The irony of the location was staggering. Rainer was the first Habsburg to be buried there since the fall of the empire. The last person to be interred before him was Emperor Franz Joseph himself in 1916. Think of the contrast. Franz Joseph, the supreme autocrat, the ruler of millions, and Rainer, the bankrupt mechanic who died of blood poisoning in a public ward. And yet, death made them equals. They would lie in the same cold darkness, just feet apart. The service was attended by the ghosts of the empire, former generals in civilian suits bowing stiffly, old countesses in moth-eaten veils, and the parents Leopold Salvator and Blanca, aged and weeping, standing on the soil that was no longer theirs, burying a son who had tried to stay and failed. The famous knocking ceremony of the Habsburg funerals, where the Grand Chamberlain knocks on the door of the crypt and the friar asks who demands entry, was not fully performed in its imperial grandeur, but the sentiment hung heavy in the incense-filled air. When the coffin of Rainer was lowered into the vault, it wasn't just a body being buried. It was the burial of the experiment. Rainer had tried to answer the question, can a prince become a citizen? The answer, lying in the bronze coffin, seemed to be a resounding, no you. The tomb of Archduke Rainer is simple compared to the Baroque monstrosities of his ancestors. It sits in the new vault. On the metal, it does not list his garage. It does not list his film business. It lists his name and his dates. The stone is cold and the silence of the crypt is absolute. As the heavy doors of the Capuchin Church swung shut, sealing him in with centuries of his kin, the crowds outside dispersed. The parents boarded the train back to Spain, back to exile. The shadow court of mechanics and projectionists went back to work. The Republic of Austria moved on, stumbling toward the even greater darkness of the 1930s, the rise of fascism, the Anschluss, and the coming war. Rainer had escaped that future. He was safe in the past. But he left behind a legacy that was as fractured and complex as the film reels he used to smuggle across the city. He was a man who was crushed between two tectonic plates of history. He was the prototype of the modern royal, the working prince, but he was a prototype that malfunctioned. His death marked the end of the transition period. The window of possibility where a Habsburg could be a dashing entrepreneur in Red Vienna was closed. The lines were drawn. You were either with the past or you were with the future. Rainer had tried to be both, and it had torn him apart. As we stand outside the crypt, it is tempting to ask if his life was a failure. But before we can answer that, we must look at the brutal aftermath that followed the closing of those bronze doors. When the heavy bronze doors of the Imperial Crypt clanged shut on May 28, 1930, they did not just seal away the body of Archduke Rainer. They sealed the fate of the Tuscan line's fragile foothold in the Austrian Republic. The funeral had been a momentary suspension of reality, a brief, incense-clouded hallucination where the empire lived again. But as the crowds dispersed and the black horses were unhitched from the hearse, the cold, hard light of the 1930s broke over Vienna. The mechanic prince was gone, and without his frantic energy, the machinery of the family's survival began to grind to a halt. The immediate casualty of Rainer's death was not financial, but emotional. His father, Archduke Leopold Salvator, was a man broken by the 20th century. He had lost his military command, his country, his estates, and now his firstborn son. Leopold had been the visionary of the family, the inventor who loved internal combustion engines, the man who had unknowingly set Rainer on his tragic path by teaching him to hold a wrench. Seeing his son buried, not as a hero of the realm, but as a worn-out civilian exhausted by the struggle to pay bills, was a blow from which the old Archduke could not recover. Leopold Salvatore and Infanta Blanca boarded the train back to Barcelona immediately after the funeral. The journey must have been a silent, suffocating ordeal. They were returning to an exile that was becoming increasingly precarious. Spain, their refuge, was trembling with the same republican tremors that had shattered Austria. King Alfonso XIII was losing his grip on power. The Spanish sanctuary was about to collapse. Less than a year later, on September 4th, 1931, Archduke Leopold Salvatore died in Vienna, having returned there in a final attempt to settle the family's chaotic affairs. He died just 16 months after his son. The narrative symmetry is brutal. The father and the son, the two modernizers of the Tuscan branch, were wiped out just as the world entered its darkest decade. With their deaths, the Palais Toscana lost its heartbeat. The massive building in the 4th District, which Rainer had tried so desperately to maintain with his garage earnings and film smuggling, effectively ceased to be a home and became a mausoleum of dead. But there is another cruel historical irony that we must examine, one that centers on Rainer's business. Rainer died in May 1930. This date is significant in the history of cinema. It marks the precise tipping point between the silent era and the sound era. The Jazz Singer had premiered in America in 1927, but it took a few years for the technology to dominate Europe. By 1930, the talkies were arriving in Vienna. Why does this matter? Because Rainer's entire business model, the bicycle system, relied on the simplicity of silent film. A silent film reel is just images. It can be projected on any machine. It can be run at variable speeds. It is resilient. But sound film? Sound film required synchronization. It required delicate optical tracks or synchronized discs. You couldn't just rip a reel out of a projector, throw it in a motorcycle sidecar, race across cobblestones at 40 miles per hour, and thread it into a different machine at a different theater without risking a technical disaster. Furthermore, the arrival of sound consolidated the power of the big American and German studios. They tightened their grip on distribution. The loose, Wild West network of independent theaters that Rainer had serviced was being bought up or forced out of business. Had Rainer not died of sepsis in 1930, he would have woken up in 1931 to find himself bankrupt. His skills were specific to a transitional moment in technology that was ending. The mechanic prince was, in a devastating twist of fate, spared the humiliation of professional obsolescence by his own untimely death. He exited the stage exactly as the curtain came down on his era. In the wake of his death, the Tuscan siblings, Rainer's brothers and sisters, scattered like leaves in a storm. They lacked Rainer's dogged determination to stay in Vienna and fight the daily grind. Some remained in Spain, only to be swept up in the chaos of the Spanish Civil War that erupted in 1936. Others drifted to the United States or South America. The cohesive family unit that Infanta Blanca had fought so hard to preserve was atomized by the pressures of history. Back in Vienna, the political weather was turning from gray to black. The republic that Rainer had tried to serve as a citizen was eating itself. The streets where he had raced his motorcycles were now battlegrounds. In 1934, the Austrian Civil War broke out. The socialists, the very people Rainer had rubbed shoulders with in the garages, were shelled into submission by the Austro-fascist government of Engelbert Dollfuss. The Schutzbund was crushed. The democratic experiment was over. We must ask the what-if question. What would have happened to Rainer had he survived the infection? Imagine him in 1938. The Anschluss. Adolf Hitler, a man who had walked the streets of Vienna at the same time as Rainer, perhaps passing him in a crowd, returns as the conqueror. The Nazis had a complicated, largely hostile relationship with the Habsburgs. They viewed the old dynasty as a rival symbol of authority, a multicultural abomination that stood against the purity of the German Reich. Archduke Franz Ferdinand's sons were sent to Dachau concentration camp. Other family members were harassed, arrested, or forced into deeper exile. Rainer, with his history of shady business dealings, his association with the Jewish-dominated film industry of the 1920s, and his well-known profile as a fallen prince, would have been a prime target for the Gestapo. He would not have been viewed as a useful mechanic. He would have been viewed as a piece of human debris from a hated past. His death in 1930, therefore, takes on a different complexion. It was a tragedy, yes, but it was also an escape. Rainer never saw the swastika flying over the Hofburg. He never saw his beloved Vienna turned into a province of the Third Reich. He never saw the Jewish theater owners he had worked with, his partners in the bicycle system, rounded up and deported to the death camps. He died while Vienna was still, in some broken way, free. He died while there was still a lingering romance to the struggle. Schloss Herrnstein, the estate he had tried to save, eventually fell out of the family's grip. The financial burden was too great. The property that had been the sanctuary of his youth, the place where he had learned to hunt and drive, became just another asset liquidated to pay for the survival of the living. Today it stands as a seminar hotel, its halls filled with corporate managers learning about efficiency, a concept Rainer understood all too well, though it never saved him. By the late 1930s, the memory of Herr Habsburg began to fade from the collective consciousness of the city. The garage at the Palais Toscana was closed or rented out. The motorcycles were sold for scrap or parts. The projectionists who had caught the hot reels from his hands grew old or were drafted into the Wehrmacht. The specific gritty texture of his life, the smell of the oil, the roar of the engine, the taste of cheap wine in a 4th District dive bar, was washed away by the deluge of blood that was World War II. But in the silence of the crypt and in the dusty archives of the Viennese police, the story remained. It waited like a dormant seed. The story of the Archduke who didn't run. The story of the man who tried to bridge the gap between the divine right of kings and the internal combustion engine. As we prepare to close the book on Rainer's life, we must look at the final ledger. What was the cost of his experiment? He traded his title for citizenship, but died a second-class citizen. He traded his leisure for labor, but died penniless. He traded his family's safety for a chance to hold on to their home, but the home was lost anyway. On paper, Rainer's life is a catalog of failures. He failed to save the estate. He failed to restore the family fortune. He failed to find a place in the New World. But history is not just a list of victories. It is also a record of the human spirit under pressure. And in that record, Rainer stands tall. He was the only Habsburg who looked the 20th century in the eye and didn't blink. He didn't retreat to a villa in Switzerland to write memoirs about the good old days. He got under the hood of the car and tried to fix it. The tragedy is not that he failed to fix it. The tragedy is that the car was driven off a cliff by forces far greater than any mechanic could control. This erasure is not just metaphorical, it is physical. In fact, if you walk down Argentinierstrasse in Vienna's 4th district today, looking for the grand stage where Rainer acted out his tragic play, you will find absolutely nothing. The Palais Toscana, the massive neo-Baroque fortress that served as his cradle, his garage, and his prison, is gone. In 1945, 15 years after Rainer was laid to rest, the Allied bombers came for Vienna. The city that had once danced to waltzes burned to the ground. A bomb struck the Palais Toscana, shattering the wing where Rainer had once huddled in the cold, counting his shillings. The damage was severe, but perhaps repairable. However, in the grim utilitarian world of post-war Austria, there was no appetite for saving the homes of dead princes. The new republic had no use for palaces. In 1946, the ruins were bulldozed. Where the mechanic prince once parked his motorcycles and plotted his film distribution routes, there is now a modern nondescript office building. The physical erasure was complete. The grease stains on the flagstones, the smell of celluloid in the drawing rooms, the echo of his footsteps in the great hall, it was all pulverized into dust and carted away to fill the bomb craters of a broken city. But Rainer's life had ended. His prototype was just being born. For decades, he lay in the silence of the new vault, a footnote in the complex genealogy charts of the dynasty, dismissed by historians as the failure who died young and broke. They looked at his life and saw only a crash. But history is patient. It waits for the world to rotate until the light hits the archives from a different angle. In the 21st century, that light has finally arrived. We have stopped looking at the men who sat on thrones and started looking for the men who struggled in the margins. In an era defined by the gig economy, by the collapse of traditional career paths, and by the constant, exhausting need for self-reinvention, the ghost of Archduke Rainer suddenly resonates with a vibrating, electric frequency. He was not a failure. He was a time traveler who arrived too early. Rainer was the first modern royal, the original crash test dummy for a transition that every monarchy in Europe would eventually have to make. Long before the televised abdications and the tabloid exploits of the current century, Rainer walked out of the palace and clocked in. He proved that the transition from God's anointed to tax-paying citizen is not just a legal process, but a brutal psychological amputation. He showed us that you cannot simply take off the crown and put on a cap without a part of you dying in the process. His story serves as a dark mirror to our own obsession with identity. We live in a world where we are told we can be anything, that we can hustle our way to survival. Rainer believed that dream. He believed his value lay in his hands, in his bicycle system, in his ability to fix what was broken. He believed that meritocracy could replace aristocracy. But his tragedy reveals a cynical truth. The world punished him for his name while simultaneously stripping him of the privileges that name provided. He was trapped in the suffocating gap between who he was born to be and who he needed to be. And yet there is a strange, quiet victory in his anonymity. Think back to those nights in 1923. The rain is slick on the cobblestones. The projectionist at the Apollo Kino is checking his watch, sweating because the reel is running out. And then, out of the darkness, comes the roar of an engine. A figure in leather goggles kicks the bike stand down, grabs the metal canister, and hands it over. The show goes on. The audience laughs at Buster Keaton. They are transported away from their hunger and their cold for 90 minutes. They don't know that the courier is the great-grandson of a Grand Duke. They don't know he is an Archduke of Austria. And in that moment, Rainer doesn't need them to know. He isn't serving the empire. He isn't serving the dynasty. He is serving the people. He is bringing them light in the darkness. Today, if you visit the Imperial Crypt, you have to push past the crowds flocking to the massive ornate sarcophagi of the emperors. You must go to the simple metal box tucked away in the shadows. There are no weeping angels here. There are no crowns. Just a name, Archduke Rainer of Austria, 1895 to 1930. It is a silent monument to the path not taken. As we step back out into the bright, noisy streets of modern Vienna, a city of electric cars, delivery drivers, and gig workers, we are walking in Rainer's world. The empire of marble and gold is dead. The empire of mechanics, of speed, of commerce, that empire won. Rainer didn't fail. He was simply the first one through the wall. And as anyone who works with mechanics knows, the first part to take the friction is always the one that burns out. The mechanic prince is dead. Long live the mechanic.